Welcome the author of States Have Powers, The Powers of the People, and New Hampshire State Representative Dan Itse'e.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I've heard so many things touched on that I'd really like to address, but I'm not going to, because then I wouldn't have time to say what I really came here to say. First of all, just shameless self-promotion here. I do have a book. I have several, about 40 copies available at the back, and I'd really love to sell you one. I also have some other materials, commentary on the Constitution of the state of New Hampshire, most particularly. And like Senator Sanborn, in my opinion, that's where it is. I would say that that's the one you ought to read every year, and you could go to several year intervals on the federal Constitution. It's the states where the power is supposed to be. The power of the federal government, as Madison said, the powers of the general government, that's the term they used, are few and well defined, while the powers of the states are expansive and undefined. But the thing I'm really going to address today is the meaning of the term general welfare. We all suppose that it's this blanket term that doesn't really have a meaning. And when our founders put it in our constitutions, because it doesn't just appear in the federal constitution, but analogs to it appear in the state constitutions as well, it had a particular meaning. They knew what they were putting in. And it is actually a term that limits the power of government. Now, I want to give you some historical context. It was said that we had two constitutional conventions. We've had actually that resulted in a constitution. Actually, we've had 3 constitutional conventions. One was actually our first legislature, or the legislature at the time created our first constitution. You live in the state that was created by the first written constitution in the history of the world. That's us. Then, and that was 1776. It was a very short constitution. Like most of the constitutions at the time, it had a high concentration of power, much like the Articles of Confederation. That was one of the major issues when they created the Constitution, was to separate the 3 powers of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. 1779, we held, our first one was a temporary constitution intended for the duration of the war and looking forward to reunification with Great Britain. When it appeared that was not going to be the case in 1779, they said, well, we'll have to really sit down, and we held the first constitutional convention in the history of the world. July of 1779, Massachusetts held theirs in September. They basically recodified the existing constitution. The people looked at it and they said, no, we reject it. That was 1780. 1781, we hold another convention. Got basically the Bill of Rights, which was one of the major defects they saw. And a government looks pretty much like what we have now, and the people looked at it and they said, that's too radical. Nah. 1783, we came back again, and we had what was a substantially more parliamentary form of government, same Bill of Rights, and the people affirmed it. We're one of the few jurisdictions to ever reject a proposed constitution. Took us 3 tries to get what we got to now. Now, I'm going to introduce you to what I think are the 27 most important political words probably in the history of the world. And they're important because not only for what they say, but they tie our state constitution to a body of work that is the foundation of what our founders were thinking when they created our governments. Now, you'll find bits and pieces of these thoughts throughout all the other 13 state constitutions. And what you have to realize in 1776, when they were holding the Congress for the Declaration of Independence, while they were there, a number of the delegates asked John Adams to write what he thought a state constitution should look like. And then that was sent back to the states. Now, we already had ours. We had created ours in January. But it went back to the states, and the other states created their constitutions in the fall of that year. And so you see a couple of them, particularly Maryland and Pennsylvania, really look like the document that he proposed. It is the document that Massachusetts adopted in 1779 or 1780. But you'll also see bits and pieces of it in the other constitutions, and you'll see ideas like government originates from the people. And you'll see, the general idea of government coming up organically from the people. But you will only find those ideas tied together in one cohesive thought in one constitution, and that's ours. The words are so powerful that I would say, just like, when Jesus was asked what was the most important law, he said to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, and all your soul. And the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. This one article carries the whole intent of the Constitution in it. The rest of the Bill of Rights is essentially an expository on that one article. And then, of course, Part 2, the form of government, is an expository on the Bill of Rights. All men are born equally free and independent. Therefore, so there's a connection, it's causative. Therefore, all government of right, all legitimate government, all government of right originates from the people, is founded in consent, and instituted for the general good. And we call it general good. In Article 10, we call it common benefit. In the Constitution for the United States, we call it the general welfare. But you can see the common construction. It applies to all, and it lifts up. Well, what that phrase actually does is it connects our Constitution uniquely and unequivocally to Locke's second treatise on government. Now, it's an awesome document. I actually read it a couple of years ago, and that's when I began to see exactly what our Constitution was. Now, he has a lot of chapters. He describes the state of nature. He describes what property is. But Chapter 8 is the beginnings or the origins of political societies or civil government. So let me read you the first sentence of that and tell me if you recognize it after what I read in our Constitution. Men being, as is said by nature, all free, equal, and independent. No one can be put out of his estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. Does that sound familiar? We go on to the next one, the ends of civil political society and government. Or the ends is not the cessation, it's the purpose. The purpose of political society and government. And in it, he talks about when man is in a state of nature, and it's kind of a theoretical state. Nobody's ever really in a state of nature. If I'm an engineer, and you have the evaluation of a function at, say, infinity. So what would the value of that be at infinity? Well, what would it be a man's state if he were truly in a state of nature? Once he gets married, he's not actually in what they define as a state of nature, because it requires there be no other people, in essence. When a man is in the state of nature, he has all legislative, judicial, and executive power. Within his sphere, he determines what the laws are. If someone violates those laws, then he determines what the penalty is. He apprehends the miscreant, and he executes judgment. And he goes on to say that the reason that we create societies is because if you really had all these little duchies, as it were, side by side, there are three major defects to this condition. The first is that you and your neighbor are not going to probably have the same idea of what the laws are. Now, you may both agree that me taking something of Caleb's is stealing. But I think that his hand should be cut off, and he thinks his hand should be slapped. Okay? So you have a discrepancy. Then there's the issue of judicial. Who's going to be the judge? Me? I'm also the injured party, and every man, being self-interested is going to be more decided to convict when he's transgressed upon, or if he's the miscreant, he's going to be more disposed to acquit himself. And then you come to the problem of enforcement. In my pursuit of him for stealing my badge, and I think his hand should be cut off, I might just kill him by accident. Or he may be so lucky as to kill me. So it really doesn't work out too well when we live in this state of nature. But it's a theoretical limit. But we enter into a state of society for the purpose of having common laws, an objective judiciary, and an executive to whom we all submit. This gives us stability. It gives us protection of our property. And we get to the conclusion of his section on the ends of government. And he says, but though when they enter into society, give up the equality, liberty, and executive power they had in the state of nature into the hands of the society, to be so far disposed by the legislative as the good of the society shall require, yet it being only with an intention in everyone, this is that self-interest thing, everyone to better preserve himself, his liberty, and his property. So life, liberty, and property. For no rational creature can be supposed to change his condition with an intention to be worse. Now there's the conditional. The power of the society or legislative constituted by them can never be supposed to extend farther than the common good. The general good, the common benefit, the general welfare. So let's turn that idea around. We've just been given the definition. The general laws comporting to the common good are prohibited from leaving anybody in a worse estate than they would have had in their state of nature. Each and every law that we institute up in Concord must leave everybody no worse off than if there were no law and no government. That's an entirely different standard than what we perceive. I mean, think about it. Can you logically say, well, for the common defense, it's reasonable that to exact a tax for the common defense so that the Huns can't come in and invade us and take our property? That makes sense. Does it make sense to say that I must take money from Representative Wolper and give it to Mr. Quinn, even though he would not have done so by his own free will? That fails the test of the common good. That's why our Constitution, we can make him give to you, just not the other way. He's from out of state.
For me too. So.
Oh, there you go. Now, this is really important stuff. This mystical term, the general welfare, is not really so mystical at all. It has a definition that our founders understood when they put it in there. And it is probably the greatest restriction on the powers of the general government, far more than the first 10 articles of the amendments. Now, let's look at Article 10. Now, how much time? I still have time, don't I?
Yes.
Article 10 is Article 10, which is the other place that this idea appears. Government being instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the whole community, and not for the emolument of any one man, family, or class of men. Emolument is payment from the government. Therefore, so again, we can't use government to enrich a class of men, no matter what that class is, whether it's because they're poor, because they're Protestant, because they're Catholic, because they live in a town that has fewer businesses. We can't use government to transfer wealth. Therefore, whenever the ends of government are perverted and the public liberty manifestly endangered, and all other means of redress are ineffectual, the people may, and this appears in only one other constitution, and of a right ought to reform the old or establish a new government. The doctrine of non-resistance against arbitrary power and oppression is absurd, slavish, and destructive of the good and happiness of mankind. Now, we talked about an Article 5 convention. That's one of our methods of redress. If we believe the federal government is actually that far out of control, then we really can't resort to arms until we've attempted to have an Article 5 convention and failed. Whether because we can't get enough calls, or we present articles of amendment and they're not adopted and the abuse goes on. But I want you to think about, what does it mean when the public liberty is manifestly endangered? Because I used to think it was a really squishy statement. I don't anymore. If you are afraid of expressing your opinion, your public liberty, for fear of the government, not for fear of your neighbor. The constitutions don't govern what you do to your neighbor. They govern what the government does to you and your neighbor. If you are afraid to express yourself in public for fear of the government, that's when your public liberty is manifestly endangered. And I would argue that we are on the precipice of that. We're treading on the edge. I don't know that we're there in wholesale. I mean, we have hate crimes, yeah, but we don't have the situation where preachers are disallowed from preaching against transgressions of their faith in their own church. We haven't reached that point yet. We're tipping on the edge. But it's coined in the Constitution book, and I have lots of these in the back, as the right of revolution. And I want to caution you, it's much stronger than that. Who knows what the word ought means? It's even stronger than must. I told you I was an engineer. I am an engineer. But my minor in college was philosophy. And I kicked myself for probably 20 years after that, saying, what the heck did I do philosophy for? What use was that? But I walked out of that class with one piece of knowledge. Ought is the moral imperative. And if you look it up in your dictionary, ought is duty. So when you read your Constitution, your state constitution in particular, and you see the word ought, those articles are of supreme importance. It is what must be done because it is the right thing to do. So when it says the people may, and of a right ought, to reform the old or establish a new government, that says, don't let this get away from you. Don't surrender your liberty to the government. Don't let it go south. You have an obligation to yourself and to your posterity, and for that matter, for those who died before you defending that liberty, to reign in that government. How much time do I have left?
About 10 minutes, right?
I have 10 minutes left. Wow. Imagine that, a speaker who finishes ahead of time. The dinner's not ready yet either. So let's see what some of the other ideas that we touched upon here. General welfare. We touched about general welfare. Well, if there can be, is there any legitimate place in our governments for special welfare? What does Article 10 say? It says that it's not to be used for the emolument of any one man, family, or class of men. So there is no place in our state government, or in our federal government for that matter, for that idea of special welfare. Here's another idea I want to tie together for you. If we can see, per Article 1 of our Constitution, that they said explicitly, and here's the other thing I forgot to say prior. We had the first state constitution, and then all the other states created their constitutions later in 1776. Massachusetts in 1779. When we wrote our Bill of Rights, it was retrospective to all the other constitutions. We sat there and we said, what didn't they say that ought to be said? And being an engineer, I went through all the state constitutions of the period, and I looked for liberty words, if you will. And I came up with about 15. They're in the book. But only New Hampshire has all of those liberties articulated either explicitly or implicitly. Georgia has almost none of them. So when they try to say ours is a knockoff of Massachusetts, or when you look at Article 1, where you never see those ideas of government originating in the people, being founded in consent, and instituted for the general good, you never see them all in one sentence anywhere else. That's because our founders sat there and said, nobody's done it. And they put it together. But if, as our Constitution it ties strongly to Locke, and you see those references replete in many of the other constitutions, and you see the term the general welfare in the federal Constitution, I want you to think, if the governments do not have the power to diminish your rights of life, liberty, and property relative to your state of nature, could they have submitted you to a government who could? Therefore, the federal government, or as they call the general government, is equally restrained from infringing upon your rights of life, liberty, and property relative to your theoretical state of nature. It's not a mystery. We've simply forgotten it. Thank you. Questions?
So, what about education? Should we be, there's all this talk about UNH tuition is too high and we should put more money into UNH so they can be used in state tuition. Is that general welfare?
I would argue that it's general welfare. I would look at how those who wrote the Constitution. One of the other things I have back there is a commentary on the Constitution of the state of New Hampshire. And I was asked to write it by one of my mentors in 2006. And it was a really interesting journey because as I'd read our Constitution before. But when you start having to read it in order to say something about each and every article, you read it in a whole different way. And in the intervening years, it was about now 11 years ago, every session or term when we have constitutional controversies, I update it. It's grown from about 80 pages to 120 pages. But I always look to the people who wrote the Constitution or the amendments to the Constitution to look at how they practiced what was there. And if you look at our original Constitution, and this article stayed in force until the mid-60s, all education funding was local. The state prescribed the method or the formula by which the towns would raise the money, but it did not flow to the state and then back to the towns. All education funding was local. It also required all teachers to be Protestants. But that's another story. But so the idea of the state funding education, I don't think so. The idea of it being parents working together to best educate their children as they see fit. A lot of the towns in New Hampshire were created around churches. So when you read the original rendering of Article 6, it referred to towns, parishes, bodies, corporate, and religious. And, well, no, they took towns out. But, so the towns, the towns grew up around churches, so a lot of the school towns were religious churches. They were convened in the local church, and so this was a common theme. So the idea that a town can't fund a religious school is contrary to the history of New Hampshire. Now, what it did say, and it still does sort of, it was when they made that amendment, they really butchered it. Okay, it's an amendment that isn't even linguistically sound. But all that aside, what they did say was that nobody could be compelled to pay to a school outside of their religion. So if you were in a town that the only school was a Protestant school and you were a Catholic, you couldn't be compelled to pay taxes to send your child to the Protestant school. But that's a different twist on the same subject. That allowed you to keep your money and educate your child the way you saw fit, even if it meant sending them to the local Catholic school.
So, in the general welfare clause, I've heard that brought up a lot of healthcare debate, and also our amendments don't feel like that.
Well, think about what happened. How do we get to where we are? Prior to the 1930s, there was no welfare system as we know it. What was talked about was poor relief. And every time a poor relief bill got before the Congress, it was defeated because there was no provision for poor relief in the federal Constitution. Then somebody had a bright idea. Let's call it welfare. And there's the general welfare clause. And somehow, suddenly, having forgotten what general welfare means, it seems to comport with the Constitution. So, as it was thought of at the time that when they wrote the Constitution, poor relief is not under the purview of the federal government. In fact, in New Hampshire, where is poor relief found? And you probably all who live in New Hampshire, have somebody with this title. Town Welfare Office. What's the legislative body of the town? All the inhabitants. So people vote whether or not to tax themselves for poor relief. It's not some goobers in Concord voting to take money out of their pocket, or a bunch of yahoos down in Washington, D.C. voting to take money out of their pockets. It's them themselves deciding to do so.
Sorry, healthcare.
Well, if poor relief isn't in the Constitution, and general welfare says that I, Mr. Federal Government, can't reduce your life, liberty, and property compared to your state of nature, do I have any power to require you to get health insurance? It's not requiring you to get health care, it's requiring you to buy health insurance. What is insurance? Insurance is protection against the improbable, not what you do every day. Do I, Mr. Federal Government, have the power to require you to take out of your money and give to some third party for a product you don't want? I think the answer is simple. Especially relative to my state of nature.
The statement in Article 10, which talks about reforming or replacing government, isn't that written kind of nebulously so that it could actually be a might makes right situation?
Well, I think probably the War for Independence was kind of a might makes right situation. But that notwithstanding, what are your first instances of reform and replace? Constitutional Convention. We have a requirement that a Constitutional Convention be on the ballot every 10 years. The legislature can choose to put it on the ballot more frequently than that. There is nothing that would stop a Constitutional Convention in the state of New Hampshire from replacing the Constitution if they thought it to be the right thing. It's amendments, but amendments means deleting amendments. It means changing existing articles. It means adding new articles. So you could, well, our second government was, excuse me, a president elected directly by the people, and a House of Representatives and a Senate. Then the Senate and House in joint session elected an executive council comprised of 3 representatives and 2 senators. And the president was also the president of the Senate. In 1792, we changed that substantially, where executive councils were directly elected, which meant the legislative branch had no power in confirming judges and other commissioned officers. We renamed the president and governor and separated him from the Senate. So we substantially changed our form of government only 8 years later. So we can certainly reform the government if we think it to be abusive to our liberties.
Let's give a round of applause for Representative.